Yeah, it's after the 2009 record flood that we had, the entire community came out to lend support for temporary flood protection elements, doing sandbagging. I mean, we had the colleges and the schools out there on the front lines putting sandbags down all day, in preparation for this flood event.
Hey, folks. Welcome to another edition of the 21st Century Engineer, a podcast targeting mid-career professionals and younger to give them insights, perspectives, value, if you will, for the time that you spend with us to learn things that will help you in your career. We have a really interesting conversation today. Joel Paulsen is going to be with us and talk about the Fargo Moorhead Diversion Project, a really successful project I learned about from somebody that was previously on my podcast, an example of how to do things right, even when not everything goes right. And with that, Paul, I keep saying Paul, Joel, I truly do apologize. It's my default. Anyway, Joel, could you give us a little bit of an idea as to who you are, what you're about, what you hope the listeners take away from who you are today?
Yeah, certainly, Dennis, and thanks for having me today. I think we're going to have a great discussion about the Fargo Moorhead Diversion Project and my experiences and role in that. As you mentioned, my name is Joel Paulsen. I am a civil engineer, graduated from North Dakota State University, went into private practice as a consulting engineer on the municipal side of things for about 20 years in the Red River Valley, which is the border between North Dakota and Minnesota, and the Red River flows north into Canada and ultimately into the Hudson Bay. Working for communities within the valley, it just inherently exposed me to flooding and flood protection because it's one of the flattest places on this planet, and the river flows north. And so you have the southern part of it thawing before the northern part is, which presents a whole host of issues in the springtime when the snowpack melts and presents flooding as a major risk item. So I spent many years working with small communities to implement certified flood protection, and ultimately I ran for city council in the city of Moorhead, which was a partner in the Fargo Moorhead Diversion Project. And the mayor found out that I was a civil engineer, and she put me on the project as a board member. And from that point, moving forward, as the project began to progress, I did resign from my council position, and I took the executive director role, in which I led that project for 5 years through the implementation of it.
Maybe that's the mayor's plan all along, but we won't get into the politics of the situation. The project was actually, by the time it got to its end, was actually a fairly large project, over $3 billion. And as I understand it, it was kind of a funding cornucopia, I guess, my word. Fruit salad might be another word. Could you get kind of overview what the scope of the project was and where you had to go?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the Red River Valley is completely flat. And so it doesn't take much water for the Red River to overflow its banks and spread out over miles in both directions, on the Minnesota and the North Dakota side. And so after 1997, when we experienced our sister city to the north of Fargo, Grand Forks, completely devastated, the entire community was wiped out during that flood event. That was prior to Hurricane Katrina. And at that time, it was the largest peacetime evacuation of a municipal community within the United States. Obviously, Hurricane Katrina overtook that, and there's been other hurricane events since then that have kind of taken that prize. But at the time, it was a major event. We had Army Corps of Engineers, the Coast Guard, evacuation of an entire community of about 60 to 80,000 people. trying to find places for them to live until they could go back and and take care of the devastation and destruction that occurred. So we were sitting in Fargo at that time, and we barely fought that one. And we had minimal damage, but there was still the disruption of doing a temporary flood protection fight. And we see our neighbors to the north with complete destruction. So we started talking about how can we provide permanent, resilient flood protection for the community of Fargo, which is much bigger than Grand Forks, and really is the economic engine of North Dakota. It's the largest community in North Dakota. It's very diversified from technology to manufacturing. The largest hospital within 300 miles is in Fargo, numerous higher ed facilities. It's a community that has to be protected long-term from the risk of flood protection. So that got into the discussion of, okay, what can we do? And really one of the only options that presented itself was a diversion, where we actually built a engineered channel around the community to take the flood water and relieve it into that engineered channel, and then monitor and meter the amounts of water both in the main stem and in the engineered channel to ensure that you're safely passing water around the community. And so that was the concept, and that started early in the 2000s and really gained steam after 2009, which ended up being the record flood year in Fargo, the highest peak that we had ever seen. And we were actually within inches of losing the community in that event. Had it not froze that night, everyone is certain we would have lost the city of Fargo, and it would have been very similar to the destruction that we saw in Grand Forks. But fortunately, the river crested on a very, very cold night, which we believe kind of froze everything up and allowed us to kind of get through that event and start to move forward. And at that point, it was readily apparent something needed to be done as quick as possible.
Well, that's an interesting way of educating the public about the need for infrastructure, but at least nobody was hurt. And it's obvious. And I know that the result of the project was not just a safer environment. You talked about the resilience of the system and that being designed in. There are a number of other benefits that come from that, including just the fact that home insurance rates have to go down, and
That's right.
or at least not go up in anticipation of what it is, or what some insurance companies did. What we saw down in on the coast with Katrina was some of them segregated flood damage from regular home, and a lot of homes never picked up the flood insurance, and that got to be a big argument for years, whether it was flood or wind or whatever. So
yeah. In Fargo, we had 12,000 structures that were in the 100-year floodplain remapped. So in the mid 2000s, FEMA came through and did a remapping effort. Yeah. 12,000 additional structures were added to the floodplain during that event. So needless to say, that the flood insurance and the premiums and the impact to the economy of managing that risk was certainly a driver in moving forward with a permanent, resilient flood protection plan, just as well paired with, what we saw. We knew what the risk was. We knew how much the insurance premiums were. It was really a no-brainer. I mean, the project made sense from every angle you looked at it, from an economic standpoint and a life and safety standpoint.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times, again, New Orleans, Katrina, other areas as well, will sit back and wait for the federal government to fix all this. But I understand that in this particular project's case, it was a combined effort financially. Of course, that engages other entities and agencies in the decision and delivery process. Could you talk a little bit about that? Let's start off with the financing. I mean, who paid for this? I mean, this is a huge project.
Yeah,
I was indirectly involved in the Tennessee Tom Bigby waterway, and some of the construction over there, the divide cut, some of the rechannelization of the river, just abandonment of the river, cutoffs, not easy. This is a big task.
It is, and the overall footprint of the proposed project was between 50 and 70,000 acres. a 30-mile long engineered channel. About 50 million cubic yards of material needed to be moved. 13 bridges, 2 aqueduct structures where you're actually taking a river over the engineered channel, and 3 large, massive control gates to control everything. So this was a massive undertaking of infrastructure. It started out around about $1 billion when the first concept was pitched by the Corps of Engineers. And as you know, over the course of 10 years, that ends up being about $3 billion by the time you get everything constructed. So it's really started after that 97 event and really kind of got supercharged after the 2009 record. And that the Corps of Engineers were involved in the planning process the whole time. We were initially looking at doing this as a traditional Corps project where the federal government kicks in, a 65%, and the local non-federal sponsors put in a remaining 35%. And we started to develop it under that concept. But what we quickly realized was that our cost benefit ratio for the city of Fargo, because it's so spread out, and even though, a majority of the city is at risk of a 100-year flood, we just couldn't get a very high cost benefit ratio because we don't have the population of a New York City or a Boston or a Houston. And so we saw our cost benefit, anywhere between a 1 and below a 3. But when we started to compare that to other programs, excuse me, across the country, we knew that we were at the back of the bus as far as federal funding was concerned. We got the project authorized, but we knew funding was a different story because you have to get that appropriated through WRDA and through Congress. And Congress really only appropriates anywhere between $8 to $10 billion a year, right?
Right.
And so we knew we had to do something different. And so we got this idea of, hey, let's pitch an innovative financing project to the Corps of Engineers and to Congress and see if we can't get a pilot project designation. Because what that could potentially do is take us from the back of the bus and put us at the very front. And that's what we did. We started looking around at non-traditional contract administration ideas. And the public-private partnership really came out as the most feasible alternative. And so we went to the Corps of Engineers and we said, we'd like to do this as a public-private partnership. And they looked at us like we were crazy. This was way outside of their wheelhouse. I mean, the Corps, they've done some design build, but they've never done a public-private partnership where you have a private entity and a long-term contract that operates and maintains a piece of infrastructure. The Corps is used to operating and maintaining their own infrastructure, right, or delegating to the non-federal sponsor to take care of.
P3 is not something they've been innovative with or particularly embraced because of the post-care issue that they feel that they can make sure that the project's investment is maintained in a way that it returns on that investment. Not that doesn't happen with P3 projects, but it's perspective. It's also timing. Attitudes have changed a lot about P3 over the past, I'll say, decade. But go ahead. Sorry.
That's right. So ultimately, we did get approval from Congress. We pitched this to them. We defined a project partnership agreement that was out of the ordinary for the Corps, where we had to address some of these new concepts of how do we work together in a split delivery fashion. And so what we decided to do is the Corps of Engineers would continue to use their traditional contracting design, bid, build methods for the large control structures. The reason being because they were the riskiest structures, and we didn't think private industry would take on that amount of risk to actually operate and maintain long-term the giant control structures that basically direct where the water is moving throughout the project. What we did understand is that private industry would accept the risk of the passive elements like the engineered channel, because there's really not a whole lot of operation. They just have to have the channel available for flows when the Corps of Engineers, or the Fargo Moorhead Diversion Authority, which was set up, actually operates the project. So we partitioned out all of those passive elements, which was about $1 billion out of the $3 billion. The other $1 billion side was the Corps of Engineers design, bid, build work, and then another $1 billion for property acquisition and administrative and engineering costs on the local government side. So that was kind of the arrangement, and we got that passed through WRDA 2014, designated as a pilot project, and Congress gave the Corps the authority to enter into this public-private partnership.
Super. Now, I understand one of the positives, and actually reinforce the process, because you had to go and effectively raise taxes on the local citizenry and in business in order to make this work. But you had a number of wins early on, a number of successes, if you rather, wins, W-I-N-S, not W-I-N-D-S. But anyway, what were some of those, and how did people warm up to them? I mean, how did they recognize these successes?
Yeah, it's after the 2009 record flood that we had, the entire community came out to lend support for temporary flood protection elements, doing sandbagging. I mean, we had the colleges and the schools out there on the front lines putting sandbags down all day, in preparation for this flood event. The entire community was shut down, during certain times. Unless you had an emergency vehicle, you weren't allowed on the city streets. So it was extremely impactful. So after a community, after going through something like that, truly understands what flooding means and that there needs to be a permanent solution. So shortly after that, the city of Fargo and Cass County on the North Dakota side both passed half-cent sales tax, and dedicated that half-cent sales tax directly to permanent flood protection, which later was directed to a special purpose entity called the Fargo Moorhead Flood Diversion Authority, which was really a joint powers authority put together between communities and counties in Minnesota and North Dakota. So it was a bi-state effort, a joint powers authority that ultimately became the contracting mechanism that partnered with the Corps of Engineers to deliver the P3 component and acquire all of the lands necessary for the project.
Okay. And as the project was under construction and being completed, there were things that there were gains from that project beyond just flood control that benefited the quality of life, benefited the community, benefited the ecology of the area. Is that not true?
Yeah, that's entirely true. So the project, removed a majority of the 100-year floodplain within the urban area, which, as we talked about before, was well over 12,000 structures. We estimated at the authority anywhere between $40 and $50 million worth of premium for the National Flood Insurance Program would be reduced to optional. So they'd be remapped into Zone X, which means structure doesn't have to have mandatory flood insurance.
Right.
They can choose to have it if they want. But just that economic impact alone is pretty significant for a smaller community like the city of Fargo. And not only that, but what we saw is that over the decades leading up to the discussion and the implementation of this flood control project, there were large corporations that were looking at establishing themselves in Fargo, but they were choosing not to because of the risk of flooding.
Oh.
Once we got the project moving forward and we started building, that completely changed. And so there was no longer a hesitation about flooding. And, we could show and prove that we were providing certified, accredited flood protection and removing this land out of the 100-year floodplain. And that really, we really saw a jump in economic activity just due to removing that risk that had always been prevailing within the city of Fargo.
That's excellent. People don't think about certain aspects. Unfortunately, this has certainly been a marketing tool in the front end of the project, but the fact that it wasn't, and then you see this come to fruition, that all of a sudden now you're economically growing, the socioeconomic climates become more robust. Now you're back on the list of maybe we will move there. And so that's excellent. I'm sure the powers that be have to feel pleased with. I'm going to call it the collateral benefits. You hear a lot about collateral damage, but these are the collateral benefits that come from well-planned, well-operated infrastructure.
That's right. And we were in a good spot as far as the community understanding what we needed for the project because they had gone through these flood events, right? And that is difficult to replicate in some cases. I mean, we look at communities like Miami and and New York and Boston and Houston and the list goes on. And there's valid, reasonable projects there, but they don't move forward. Yep. And why don't they move forward? Because there isn't really the political will. People don't understand what the actual risk is unless they have to go through a major disaster. And as you know, Dennis, FEMA says all the time, $1 spent on prevention will return $7 to $12
right.
in future revenues. So right. It is absolutely beneficial to be proactive about implementing flood protection. Unfortunately, it just doesn't happen that often.
Well, I can't tell you the number of times I've had people look at me either as a result of something I was trying to do or as a result of a catastrophic event in its infrastructure in the U.S. And it was like, well, it didn't happen yesterday. Why will it happen today? Or why will it happen tomorrow? Well, because you're lucky it didn't happen yesterday. And in our environment, when you're talking about natural resources and ecologically driven events, stochastic, go look that word up, folks, stochastic events that, it's like rolling the dice. Today we win. Today we win. Today we win. Today that's craps.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, you get people don't understand risk. I get in a car, there's a risk associated with me getting killed on the highway, but I did it yesterday, so the chances are I can do it again today, and that's because the risk is relatively low, but the risk hasn't gone away.
That's right. That's right.
I rode a motorcycle, Joel, for years, and I eventually learned that every time I got on the motorcycle, before I turned the key, I'd say to myself, is this the day I'm going to wreck? And it wasn't that I was hoping to wreck. It was the fact that I reminded myself that any day I rode out on that motorcycle, there could be an accident. And every accident I ever had, with save one, was not my fault. It was somebody pulling out in front, somebody doing something stupid that got me in trouble on the bike. The only one I pulled on some cobblestones during a rainstorm, and the bike actually flipped out from under me while I was sitting still. I can't. That was my stupidity. I should have kept going. Anyway, I'm getting off subject. We'll get back into motorcycling. I mean, a great thing for North Dakota and South Dakota motorcycling. We also have a Sturgis not too far from where I live. They have a bike rally at the same time Sturgis has it up your way. And the story goes that what happened was some bikers got lost, didn't know what the difference between the two, and ended up in Sturgis, Mississippi. And they said, what the heck, let's have a party.
Let's just do it here too. Yeah. Well, I think you bring up, this is a great discussion point, because I always tell people that, this project we did in Fargo, it wasn't about the dollars. It wasn't about the resiliency. What it was really at the heart of it, it was a risk management project, right? Yeah. And most infrastructure that protects people is a risk management project. And what we did and what we showed that we could do with our federal partners at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is properly allocate that risk to the parties that were in the best position to manage that risk. And we were able to create a refined and defined route for all of those different parties to work collaboratively to ultimately implement something that was far greater than the sum of its parts. And that is really, really difficult to do in today's world, to get cities, counties, states, and of course the federal government all aligned and pulling in the same direction to do something. Oh, and private industry, right? We had the public-private partnership. It wasn't just the governmental entities. Now we're in the private bond markets, we're in the private financing, we're in the private contractors, and we're trying to get them all pulling along with all of these different governmental units. Extremely difficult to get. Yeah, I always used to say it's like herding cats, right? We hear that all the time. It absolutely was
the analogy that was in the back of my mind. I was about to drop it on you. Yeah. But now that you have spoken so glowingly, how you got this bag of cats to walk in lockstep and at the same time see the reality, see the needs, see the opportunity associated with it. The question I've been just burning to ask, because of my background where I've been, that actually in some ways can be really simple compared to just trying to navigate the regulatory and design standards that come in play on a project that is this complex. And for those people that aren't painfully initiated, this is more than digging a ditch around a town. This is, I mean, the control structures, the structures that connect control structures, the operations, the design of the operational schemes behind these control structures, and at the same time, not doing adverse damage to, I'm going to call it the ecological environment of the community. I mean, they were used to having a river run downtown. So do we want the river to go away and turn it into a parking lot, or do we still expect the benefits of having a water feature in the middle of the town without all the risk? How did you guys get through all of that? The standards, the regulations, and all of that.
That was a huge part of the success on the project, but it was a lot of hard work as well and a lot of setbacks along the way. So just think about it, Dennis. You're taking 30 to 40,000 acres of 100-year floodplain, and you're taking it out of an urban environment and putting it in a rural environment.
Right.
You're telling those landowners that are now flooding, that didn't flood before, that they have to give up their land and move their family farms that they've been on for over 100 years because the city needs to be protected. So there was a huge urban-rural divide issue with this project where the rural farmers banded together, created their own joint powers, and sued the Fargo Moorhead Diversion Authority over a number of regulatory and flood control and floodplain management issues. One of them being, removing the floodplain and putting it someplace else. And anytime you do a river flood protection project, you deal with that issue. And so you talked about the complexity of this project. So you had about 5 different rivers converging within Fargo Moorhead. Each one of those rivers needed to be handled uniquely in such a fashion that there was no downstream impacts for people downstream of the city of Fargo. Okay?
Right.
And so we had to engineer and concentrate all of the floodplain impacts upstream in a mitigation area. And then we had to deal with the 2,000 property owners that were present there to try to, facilitate them finding new farmsteads, finding equivalent, acreage to continue their operations, those sorts of things. Extremely complex. I would say the lands program at the Fargo Moorhead Diversion Project was probably one of the most complicated local agencies that I've ever been involved in, because there were so many things going on. We invented new mitigation programs for these farmers. We invented a farmstead relocation program. We invented supplemental crop insurance that would go on the federal crop insurance that would protect them for man-made impacts, which is not something the federal crop insurance usually protects for. So it was a lot of innovation to get.
Joel, jumping to that, because I live in Mississippi right now, and have worked in the Mississippi Delta, talking about a flat place.
Mhm.
And the Delta actually benefits from flooding. So, uh, and you mentioned that the flood occurred at a time when I wouldn't think was particularly a growing season. It froze over and therefore didn't flood. Uh, is there a benefit to the farmers? I mean, again, you're not trying to promote flooding. You're just trying to move where the risk of flooding occurs. But I mean, for me, it would seem that the farmers have a potential benefit, but they're obviously resisting this idea of losing the 40 to 50,000 acres to this project. Was it more than that, or do they see a benefit from what came out of it?
At the end of the day, I think we saw somewhat limited financial impact to the acreage that was designated as retention area,
Right.
because of exactly what you mentioned. The flooding occurs prior to growing season. The land is still available for farm and agricultural purposes. It's still producing crops. And at the end of the day, the farmers that accepted the flowage easements that allowed the authority to retain floodwaters on their property, they got somewhere between 20 to 30% of the value of their property in a lump sum payment in order to, yeah, in order to get that flowage easement.
Yeah.
And what we saw in the marketplace was that flowage easement didn't seem to have a significant uh, effect on the value of the overall property.
Yeah.
So you're right. I think at the end of the day, with what the authority, with what the Fargo Moorhead Diversion Authority provided for mitigation programs, and how they were trying to be as empathetic as they could in dealing with relocations and those sorts of things, I think it ended up where a very small percentage of the overall property transactions ended up going into eminent domain, which I think speaks pretty well for the local government's interaction with the impacted property owners.
Well, and you used a word that's near and dear to my heart, and that's empathy. The idea that you had empathy in the process, probably prior to and certainly after the litigation engaged, to what the farmers were just fearful of. Again, it's unknown. They don't understand, and you try and explain. And at the end of the day, it's all well, how do they know? We're back into that conversation. It didn't happen yesterday. Why is it going to happen today? Kind of thing. But yeah, I don't trust you enough to believe everything you tell me. So you end up coming, well, how about if we compensate you for what we think is a worst case risk or a reasonable risk, and it becomes a win-win, other than the money that has to go away, of course. But I think it's a really important aspect of all civil projects today is that we recognize it's not just saying, well, for the sake of the city, rural be damned. We've got to. It's everybody. It's how it impacts everybody. And speaking of everybody, what we haven't touched on, but for at least just briefly, I understand that this waterway that you effectively have built goes around the city and doesn't have to cross any roads, doesn't have to deal with any infrastructure. It's just a big green grass project where you took a earth mover and dug a ditch, right?
Not quite that easy. Not quite that easy. So the ditch itself, or the engineered channel, or stormwater diversion channel, is really what we call it.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, there's about 40 to 50 million cubic yards of material that had to be moved. So this is a major mining effort, is what it ended up being.
Right.
And this fell within the private side of the public-private partnership. And so we did spent many years. We worked with 6 different development teams, narrowed that down to one single team that we awarded the $1 billion contract for the engineered channel to. Wow. And they started construction immediately, and they worked around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, for the last 3 to 4 years. And they're just finishing it up. This summer will be kind of the final touches on the project. So it was a massive effort on their part. And I'll just say this contracting arrangement, and these are Corps of Engineers numbers. The Corps of Engineers estimated that the public-private partnership contracting arrangement saved $300 million on the overall project, which is about 10% in cost
10%.
savings,
Yeah.
right? But the real issue was they estimated that the project was done 10 years sooner than it would have been done had it been done under traditional Corps of Engineers contracting and financial arrangements. And that's the biggest issue of value for us, because every single year that went by, we were at risk of losing the community.
Yes.
So the quicker we can get this project implemented and reduce that risk and take it off the table, that's what we were looking at doing. It was the trying to expedite the project. And yes, it's a multi-billion-dollar project. It's a huge project. And we were watching costs and those sorts of things. And the project actually is coming in relatively near to being on budget, which is not always typical with Corps of Engineers projects. So,
yeah, and that's not to suggest the Corps can't manage things. It's the fact that you get into projects. We've talked about the time value of money. We talk about sliding scopes. We talk about deteriorating infrastructure. There's a whole host of things that the Corps has to contend with on these. And for that matter, you had to contend with when this mega project that maybe weren't thought of early on or were considered static enough that you didn't have to worry about them, only to find out that wasn't true. So your scope keeps changing. And of course, every day you're in the field constructing is a day the project isn't finished, which is a day something else has to get done. And sometimes that thing is planned, sometimes it's not planned. And then you end up with all the other issues like storms that do occur and how that has impact on the work you're doing. So longevity is a problem, and the fact that you could get this down to less than 10 years. I wonder if IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, would have had any impact. That threw an awful lot of money into infrastructure, but it didn't all go to the Corps. In fact, only a fraction of it ended up going over there. So it probably didn't. That if that's a Corps estimate on 10 years, I'd wrap my arms around it and say that's probably pretty valid.
Yeah, so we were a recipient of IIJA funding. That is what rounded out our final federal ask. Yeah, so I think we had about $400 and some odd million in the IIJA. And what we learned and what Congress learned, and I think everybody kind of intuitively already knew this, was that if the Corps has the financial resources, they know what to do. They know how to build things. They know how to contract things. The biggest thing that holds the Corps of Engineers back is the federal annual appropriations and not knowing if they're going to get funded year after year after year. Yeah. And what the IIJA showed is that if you can give the Corps a big pile of money for their project and tell them to go, they'll go and they'll complete it efficiently and on time and on budget.
Yeah, and it's not just a pile of money this year. It's the fact that I know I've got money this year and next year and next year, and so I can start planning. Engineering projects don't get built in 15 minutes and they don't get designed in 5. It takes time. It takes planning and that stability that we've lost for too many years. And we're back in it again. That uncertainty, which we were talking about earlier, it really plays in a negative way. But the good news is you've got 10 years of growth and capacity, that economic growth, capacity, resilience, safety, on your doorstep.
That's right.
And knowing that when that event occurs, whether it be within the next 10 years or within the next 50 years, you're going to be okay.
That's right. And hopefully it never happens. And hopefully we built this and it never has to operate. But if it does have to operate, we have that insurance policy and everyone is comfortable that,
Well, that's always the other question. Well, if we go to the trouble of building this, what if it never happens? I mean, you're talking about a probability. Yeah, well, okay. The probability of a 100-year event occurring is mathematically once every 100 years, and we're having 500-year events right now. So
we have all over the place.
Yeah,
I would tell people that all the time, Dennis. I would be happy if I never saw this project operate because that's great, right? But we know from being mathematics and through mathematics and science, we know as engineers that the risk is there. And that's what these projects are for, is to deal with that insurance policy and the risk for when it does happen. And we do see it happen around the country in communities that are not always prepared.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the way I would frame it when asked the question isn't what happens if it never happened? The answer is the benefit is today. It's not the benefit, yes, will occur when you have that event, but the benefits today in that economic growth, in that industrial interest in the community, in the resilience, in the lost, nice try, in the reduced, that's what I meant to say. Similar words, they just get mixed up sometimes. Insurance rates, and I mean the litany of advantages the community is currently enjoying is the benefit.
That's right.
If it had to prevent a flood, even better.
In one more point I really want to make on bigger projects like this, multi-billion-dollar projects, we and the leaders that enacted the sales tax and got the state money and the federal money, everybody looked at this as a multi-generational project. And so that sales tax goes and is put into law all the way through 2080. So the intent is that the next generation who is benefiting from having this flood protection in place also pays a portion of that through sales tax all the way up through the 2080. And I think those long-term funding and taxing methods, it really makes these projects financially feasible, because you're spreading that out and the revenues out over the course of 60 years. And fortunately, the federal government has some great loan programs like the WIFIA and the TIFIA programs, which offer very, very low interest dollars over the course of 40 years. There's ways to innovatively put together financial concepts that will still support these large projects, despite the uncertainty we're seeing with federal funding at the moment. So,
well, I think the biggest challenge you'll have, and I don't live there, I'm not intimately involved with the project from what I understand. I think your biggest challenge is in maybe about 20 years when you find that you don't really need the tax anymore because of the economic growth that has increased the tax revenue, because of the community growth, because of the on-scene revenues that will come to the community, either through the taxation or through other revenue streams. And I've dealt with communities that had this problem. They've got a taxation system to address a bond. We're going to pay the bond off early. Now, what do we do? Do we stop the tax, or do you find another use? And I think that's going to be the conversation you're going to be having, not in 2080 or 2070, maybe as early as 2050, 2060. If this project unfolds the way you say it is, and I have every expectation it will. Sounds like a great project. I know we have come to the end of our time, and I know you know that too, and I appreciate your awareness. There's so much more we could talk about this, but I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to pick the one thing that we haven't talked about that you would really like the listeners to take away.
Yeah, I would say, Dennis, and thank you for having me again. I would say, as anybody involved in infrastructure, never take no for an answer, right? Had we taken no for an answer on this project, it would not be a reality that it is today. And had we not taken the approach of trying to be innovative and continue to push the bounds of what is allowable, we had to have 20 some acts of law changed in order to do a public-private partnership with the federal government and through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So when you looked at it from the outside in, somebody could have said, well, this is impossible. You guys are never going to be successful doing that. And look at, here we are, 10, 12 years later, successful. We got it done. We went to the front of the bus, and it's all because we wouldn't take no for an answer.
Super. And that's a great point. I mean, if there's a point to walk away with for the individuals who are listening, it is don't accept no. Certainly don't accept the first time. Don't accept the second time. Understand the reasons for the no and overcome them. Don't accept them. And if you do that, you're moving forward, not moving backwards. Joel, this has been fun. I mean, I really have enjoyed learning more about the project. I knew a little bit about it, but nowhere near what I know now. The successes, You are to be applauded for that, as is the community. And the fact that the mayor kicked you off the board and put you to work, effectively, that's a win-win for everybody, I'm sure, at the end of the day. Though maybe when this gets finished, you can go back and take on the council again.
I might just do that. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. And you'll be a hero, even better. So maybe it won't be the council, maybe it'd be the mayor's job. You didn't hear that first, folks, from me. Maybe you did. Anyway, let me wrap this and say to those who are listening, as always, I hope the time that you have spent with Joel and I, you find worthwhile, maybe a little entertaining. But more importantly, I hope that the lessons learned and the conversation we've had, shared insights that pay dividends for you. You've invested your time with us. We want to return benefit for that investment. And with that, until the next time, I hope you stay safe and stay prosperous. Take care.